I'm so excited to chat today with Melissa Doman. She's the founder of Melissa Doman Sleep Consulting, and she's got over 10 years of experience working with special needs kids. I hear from families every day with kids who are on the autism spectrum or have a sensory processing disorder. And while my rest method works really well with kids who are verbal and kids who have like a good understanding of family rules and expectations, it may not be the right fit for some neurodivergent kids. And that's when I refer out to Melissa. And today she's going to share 3 tips with us to get your special need kiddo to go to bed more quickly and sleep through the night. Okay, so welcome, Melissa. So thank you so much for being here today. I just gave a little background on you, but why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got into working with special needs kids and sleep?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, I've worked with kids with special needs for over 10 years. I think it's now 14 years if we're counting. But I first started to learn about sleep and started to, research it on my own because, as a therapist myself, here I am working with kids with special needs. And I mean, you could see the exhaustion on kids' face and parents' face. And it was kind of like, how are we going to go from here? Like, you're all exhausted. We're not able to achieve the goals that we want to with your child's therapy program. Like, we need to find a solution. And at first, parents would ask me all the time, like, what do we do about our kids' sleep? And I had no idea. So that's what led me into like learning more about sleep and the not only just like the habits and routine and sleep hygiene around it, but more importantly, what our neurodiverse kids need with regards to that brain and body balance to go to sleep as well. And that was close to 9 years ago now, that I started that journey, and that's why I'm here today.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
started as a therapist, but families were like, how are we don't even, we're so exhausted we can't even like use these tips and strategies for the day-to-day life. Like
Yeah.
you realize you needed to start with what's going on at night because it's such a foundational need. And if kids are missing that, then like nothing else is going to click.
Right, exactly. And you and I both know like just how important sleep is for brain growth and development. So if you have a child with neurodevelopmental issues on top of that, it's even more important that they're getting their sleep at night to consolidate, the information that they're getting to get things organized, to do that spring cleaning night after night. And for kids with special needs, if they're not getting the sleep that they need, like whatever their goals are when it comes to therapy or school, like it's going to be that much harder for them to achieve those things. And for parents to see their child really thrive and grow and develop in the way that they should.
Yeah, it's funny. You said spring cleaning, and I always love this visualization. I read this somewhere that, all during the day that like the synapses in your brain are firing and that they're doing all this hard work, and it almost builds up like imagine like cobwebs almost in your brain. And then
Yeah.
when you sleep, the spinal fluid like washes it all away. It's like a shower for your brain. So when you start the next day, you're fresh and clear. But literally, if you don't have that, it's just like you're working against through all the fog and cobwebs that have built up in your brain if you don't have that spring cleaning, that cleansing that happens at night.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, and it's so important, yeah, like you said, for special needs kids and, for the kids, but also for the parents. And this is stuff that I've heard from special needs parents too, where obviously parents, when we're sleep deprived, we're just as short tempered and frustrated and upset and confused. It just amplifies all of those already
Mhm.
difficult parenting emotions. And
Yeah.
then, when you're trying to parent a child who has special needs, you almost need more patience,
Yeah.
and the ability to handle all that. So it's important for those parents too to be getting the sleep. So on both
Yeah.
sides.
Yeah, 100%. And and of course, like parenting is the most rewarding and the most challenging job out there, right? And I think for special needs parents in particular, like you said, you need that additional patience and you need that additional, like you're giving that additional support 24/7 to your child, but in addition to that, I mean, I have parents who are like basically part-time nurses, they're lawyers, they're IEP advocates, like
Right.
they're chauffeur, like there's so many other hats that come along with that job description of a special needs parent. Like you owe it to your child to make sure that you're getting the rest that you need as well. And of course, like as you and I again both know, that does start with the kid and making sure they're they're settled with their sleep. You know, and that I think for a lot of parents that I talk to, they're so child focused and they want to see their child sleeping better. Like for me as a coach, it's, you know, I have to keep bringing it around to them of like, yeah, but now you need to also be resting as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a need for the whole family. So I know you've got a few tips for us today for our special needs families to help get kids to go to sleep faster and help them, get longer stretches of sleep and sleep through the night independently. So why don't we just jump into those? So start with our first good tip here.
Sure. So for me, with every child that I work with, one of the first things that we look at is bedtime routine. Now,
Okay.
obviously, bedtime routine is for all of us like our way to cue the brain and body it's time to go to sleep. But if we have a neurodivergent child, we need to make sure that the practical needs are met, but also the brain needs, the neurological needs are met as well. Because for a lot of kids that I work with, they're constantly on the go. They're going from one place to the next, this person to that person, to school, to therapy, whatever. And there's not a lot of time to make sure that those additional needs are being met. So the first place to do it is in that bedtime routine. Now, for most neurotypical kids, we usually recommend a bedtime routine that's anywhere between like 20 to 30 minutes. For
Hmm.
kids with special needs, though, obviously this kind of depends on their age. If they're under 2, this is not necessarily the case, but we're actually looking at a bedtime routine that's about 45 minutes to an hour long in
Okay.
order for us to make sure those additional needs are met, right?
Okay.
So for each family that I work with, I ask them very specific questions about where their child is developmentally, like both in the sensory areas and also with regards to motor development. So how much activity they're getting, language, stuff like that. And where there are needs or where, if we have a child with a sensory processing issue, whether they're sensory seeking, avoidant, or both things, we're going to look at those places where the child needs help and incorporate that into the routine. So for a
Give
child,
an example. Yeah, give an example of that.
yeah. So one very common thing I see with my kids, I have a lot of kids who like to co-sleep with parents, and it's not just because they need to co-sleep with parents because that's what they've learned. There's a sensory need that they're trying to achieve, right? So they want to have mom or dad there with them, so they're getting that contact, they're getting that pressure. So one of the first things that I do for those kids is we'll put in tactile activities in that bedtime routine. So joint compression massage. If the child is old enough, we might do some stretching or like heavy, like lifting work and pushing and pulling and things like that, in order to make sure that if the need is met, it's going to make our job a little bit easier when it comes to encouraging sleep independence, right?
Okay.
Or I have some kids who are very sensitive to sounds. So we'll actually we'll make random sounds throughout the bedtime routine to kind of teach them like, oh, there are sudden sounds, but actually everything is okay. So they're
Okay.
less likely to wake up to those random sounds at night, right?
Oh, kind of like like desensitizing them to it. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
So a little like kind of like, I guess, out of the box, but again, for some kids where like I have children where they'll hear the ice maker downstairs in the fridge and like that's it. Those that area of the brain that kind of controls that survival mode, that fight or flight response, it responds to that ice machine downstairs as like a threatening sound, and trying to get a kid to cool, like wind down and ease out of that is really difficult. So again, like bedtime routine is a good opportunity for us to practice that So
Yeah.
they're less likely to be woken up by those kind of sounds at night.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just kind of making sure that you've defined what all of their specific needs are, which are different for every child. I know that your plans are pretty customized to each family because not every child with special needs is going to be the same. Everything's going to be a little bit different and customized. So you're figuring out what those needs are to try to like get ahead of that and check the box during the bedtime routine, which is really similar to what we do with neurotypical kids too, which is try to get in all the snuggles and all the needs met ahead of time so that
Right.
you as the parent feel confident that you've done everything you can to kind of get those checked off ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly. And for certain kids that I work with, sometimes that sensory seek is actually just like how much they're moving through the day. I have some kids who are just nonstop on the go and they need that kind of activity right up until bedtime. So we'll incorporate, some more physical activity in that routine for that particular child,
Right.
just to make sure like the cups are completely full before bedtime. And again, like they're just less likely to do that middle of the night because a lot of kids who are constantly on the move and are constantly seeking movement and, rolling and turning up on their heads and stuff like that. A lot of times they'll wake up at 2 a.m. and want to do the same thing. Right.
Yeah.
So again, like it's all in that ilk of make sure practical needs are met, like teeth are brushed, we've used the potty before we go to sleep. But again, for a lot of our neurodivergent kids, there's a little bit more we got to put in there. And sometimes parents might even push back on like it really has to be an hour. But once they make those schedule changes in the evening and they start to incorporate all those steps, they're like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
now I get why. And most times the first place they'll see it is just in that ease of going to sleep. So even if we haven't talked about independence at all, like a lot of parents find that just with that routine and meeting those needs, the time it's taking their child to go to sleep is like that much less, that much less. So it's a very important reason why like we start with that first, because I want it to be as easy as possible for parents when they do start the sleep training part of it, because that also just brings up its own additional challenges, but
Right.
we also want to make it as easy as possible for the child as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's your first tip is really trying to identify what the child's needs are so that, like you said, all those cups are filled to
Mhm.
make the process of falling asleep as quick as possible.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Um, and then I think the next step or the next thing I often look at with my parents is actually like the nutritional component.
Okay.
Um, a lot, I would say maybe like 25% of kids that I work with, their middle of the night wake ups actually have something to do with how much calories they're getting during the day. Now, I'm not like, and I always preface this with parents. I'm like, I know you're not starving your child, but they're constantly on the go. And again, like for our neurodivergent population, the amount of brain work they have to do to say that additional word, to take that additional step, like they're just burning calories left and right. And so
And they
not
may not be
only
sitting still through a meal. They may not necessarily be sitting there
exactly.
for 20 minutes like some neurotypical kids can do and eating all of
Right.
the food at one time. It may be more of a snack bite here and there kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So like I
Harder to
have kids who
monitor.
are, yeah. So kids who are grazers, who are picky eaters. I was speaking to a mom yesterday that I'm working with. Her son has a bowl of cereal before he goes to school and won't eat anything until 4 o'clock. So when he comes home, he's like super dysregulated. He's, he's all over the place. So, for in that regard, when it comes to kids who are maybe like not getting enough, first of all, we look at what are the foods they need to have a good night's rest, right? So foods that are high in magnesium and calcium, vitamin B6. So things to help their bodies just feel more relaxed. But that calcium and B6 is very important for natural melatonin production. Like the body takes those things and without getting into the science of it, because I also don't remember all the steps, but calcium in, melatonin out, like that's the
Yeah.
that's the most important thing. So like I said, we'll talk about like what are certain foods that we can put in the child's diet. If a child is super picky, or we have a child who's maybe a grazer like that, we might have to supplement with like some of these things to make sure they're getting adequate amounts. But it also can be as simple as just, adding like a really protein rich bedtime snack.
Yep.
And if it, again, if we only have this many foods to work with, all right, we pick the one with the most amount of protein and that's our bedtime snack each night. But I have like, I'm working with a family right now. We're just like at the end of our time together, but over the last 6 weeks, we've been working on multiple different things. And the one thing that has been kind of wavering is the child's appetite. And as soon as we like bumped up the protein in his bedtime routine, like all of a sudden the 2-3 hour wake ups like started to come back down again. And I know the families who are watching this later whose kids are doing the 2 to 3 hour wake ups, they're like, yeah, I know what that's like. So, again, like nutrition is a huge component for a lot of the kids I work with. And again, it's simply just because their body's burning through energy and calories more than I would say a neurotypical child. But there are those additional feeding issues that for most kids who have special needs, we have to factor that in and keep mind of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That sounds like it makes a really big difference. Cause yeah, if you're hungry, that's going to cause you to wake up for sure.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're full and filled with the right things. So you did mention, you mentioned melatonin.
Yeah.
And I know that sometimes I have heard that sometimes with special needs kids, melatonin supplements are sometimes recommended by pediatricians, but is that something that you kind of send people to their pediatrician for, or is that kind of something that's standard for a lot of special needs kids? Because I know certainly with neurotypical kids, I'm spend my time dissuading parents
Yes.
from using melatonin and getting hooked on it.
Yeah. Well, I think for most special needs parents whose child has been struggling with sleep, the typical experience is we go to our pediatrician, we talk about it with the pediatrician, and pediatrician just says melatonin, and that's it. And it's just like, here's this thing, get out of my office, right? And I think that comes from a place of, depending on a child's diagnosis, most specialists and doctors and pediatricians, like they don't, first of all, many of them are not so informed about sleep training to begin with. But if a child has a neurodevelopmental diagnosis on top of it, forget it. Like most people assume that child's not going to understand the process, the work that has to go into getting them sleeping better, right? So very often it's just melatonin. And if melatonin doesn't work, that's when we go to medications, right? Mm-hmm. So for me as a sleep coach, my goal is to try and avoid those things as much as possible, right? And for a lot of parents that I work with, they're coming to me because it's like, been there, done that, did the melatonin, we're still having problems, right?
Yeah.
And very often, I would say close to 50% of kids that I work with, parents have tried the melatonin and things got even worse with the child's sleep. So it maybe helped with getting to sleep at night, but middle of the night, and this is in particular for my kids on the spectrum, they go to sleep at night and then they have some really deep sleep for a few hours, but that 1 to 4 a.m. time is when that sensory system starts to pick up again. So if you've just had 3 or 4 hours of really deep sleep and the sensory system's picking up, that kid's just ready to party, right? So that's usually what my parents see when they start melatonin. They're like, oh.
Yep. It's so
okay,
interesting.
Maybe,
we see the same exact thing in our business. Yeah. I mean, I see this all the time. It may help with falling asleep, but and maybe you're right about kind of you get that deep sleep and then kind of your systems just start to wake up again in the middle of the night. I kind of always thought it was because instead of your natural melatonin getting you to sleep, maybe the natural melatonin has more staying power, like for sleep. I don't know the science behind exactly why, but 100% we see the same thing with neurotypical kids,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
melatonin can make them fall asleep in a heartbeat, but causes more and longer middle of the night wake ups.
Exactly. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, part of that is the natural melatonin kind of stops sustaining. Like, of course, it goes down pretty significantly middle of the night, but it's still up. You know, the levels are still higher
Yeah.
than they are during the day to try and maintain that sleep at night, right?
Yeah.
And that second half of the night, that's where we start to transition out of like those deeper stages of sleep, and we are staying in lighter stages of sleep. They're still just as important, but I think, you know, again, for a lot of kids that I work with, that's where the transition starts to get hard, because now they're not in those deep stages. Those sensory areas are starting to like turn back on again, right?
Yeah. We're hearing the
um
ice maker.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And again, like if that child's needs are not being met during the day, guaranteed they're going to wake up middle of the night. So that's why for me, like, I find that we have much better success with boosting calcium and vitamin B6 foods to sustain melatonin more naturally. Or again, we supplement with it to make sure that they're getting adequate amounts to naturally sustain that melatonin at night. Um, and you know, for a lot of families that I work with, if their child is on melatonin, I will talk to them at the end about like, all right, now we can start weaning off of it. If the parents haven't stopped, like I have parents who tell me like, oh yeah, we forgot to give the melatonin like for 3 nights in a row, and I think everything's still okay.
Yeah. You're like,
Kind of
okay, don't
thing.
go back.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. You're done.
Exactly.
It's over.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So yeah, making sure the nutritional needs are met, that is a great tip for sure. Do you have one more for us?
Yeah, I think that if I was going to give one more recommendation, okay, I would say it's probably going to be either around like physical activity or that screen time during the day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, I say physical activity because a lot of parents, you know, most of the time when we're talking about sleep training, if we get into physical activity, the usual recommendation is like do more of it, right? To burn that, like to burn energy to create that need for sleep, right? But for some kids that I work with, we can go overboard, right? So it's all about like finding that balance, whether it's sensory or physical or whatever. So, and I've learned this over the years. I actually have parents track physical activity on their sleep log so I can see, hey, you know, when we go over 3 hours, see what happens at night. Like we have more wake ups, we have longer wake ups, stuff like that. So this is a little harder to figure out, but obviously, if your child doesn't tend to like physical activity, simply just getting them out for a walk, you know, 15, 20 minutes can be very beneficial. But we also have to be mindful that we're not going overboard and we're not overstimulating that system, right? You know, parents might tell me in follow-up calls together, like, you know, yesterday we went to the pool and then we went hiking and we did this. And I'm like, well, yeah, no wonder their sleep was terrible. They were overtired at that point, like
Right.
overstimulated. So what I would recommend to parents in that regard is to just start writing down like how much physical activity, not necessarily the activity itself, but how many minutes, hours is the child getting? And then just correlating that with what's happening at night, right?
Yep.
And most of the time, we'll start to figure out like what's not enough and what's too much. It takes a little while, but we can figure that out for sure.
Yeah. It's
And
amazing how much just writing down what is happening can be so eye-opening to
yeah,
families. Just that one step. I mean, just writing down, yeah, activity level, bed, lights out time the kid fell asleep, wake
yeah,
ups, time they woke. I mean, just seeing it is, I feel like, one of the most powerful things.
yeah, absolutely. For sure. And it's, you know, I think it's also important for parents to write things down so we can pick out the things that are succeed, you know, when things don't feel successful, it's so easy for us to like kind of focus on the negative of it, right?
Mhm.
But writing it down, it allows parents to see, okay, like, all right, yeah, last night not so great, but or the other night not so great, but last night like was a lot better. And you know, to write it down, whatever changes you're implementing, by writing it down, you can start to see where those little wins are in the
Yeah.
changes that you're making with your child.
Yeah. Well, and because we can't remember anything as parents, like you're not going to remember. So
Yeah.
just stop thinking that you're going to remember because you're not going to remember. So write it down.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
and you mentioned screen time too. Like I'm curious if kids with special needs, if those kind of recommendations differ, because I mean, we try to say, I mean, I think every kid's sensitivity to blue light and things like that is different. I mean, personally, like
Mhm.
my kids can watch TV and then go to bed. It's not a problem, but been sleeping great for their whole lives. So I think it's kind of different for every kid. But do you have any specific recommendations around screen time?
Well, I mean, my first place to start with every family is, an hour, at least an hour before bedtime, no screens at all.
Yeah,
TV,
that seems to be good
laptop. Yeah,
generally.
like that's like the standard, right? But in my experience, I do find that even if a kid, like even if we're cutting it 4 hours before bedtime, if we go over a certain amount during the day, it's almost like it charges up the battery too much, right?
Mhm.
So if I have a child like that where like we've done the hour before bedtime and things are still not totally settled, the next place we're going to look is like the total amount of screen time during the day. So I've changed this number over the years, especially after COVID, where like everybody was on screens like all day long. um, if you've done the cut an hour before bedtime, the next place to look is at total time. And my goal would be no more than like an hour, max 90 minutes. But
Per
that
day.
per day. Yeah. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but for a lot of kids that I work with, that's half the amount of time that they're getting already, right? So sometimes we really have to like cut away at it to get down to that number. But when
Yeah.
we do, that's when, oh, okay, now like the head banging or this sensory seeking behavior at night, like it starts to settle again.
I think it's
Yeah.
like a lot of recommendations that I'm sure both of us are giving to families where it seems really like earlier bedtimes, it seems really challenging and almost like insurmountable and like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, how could we do that? But then once you really commit to it and you start to make the changes, it's pretty quick to start seeing the benefits. And then you're like, okay, it's worth reducing screen time, down to 90 minutes, or it's
Yeah.
worth trying to get them to bed at, 7:15 instead of 8:15. It's worth the
Yeah.
sacrifices when you see the benefits.
Yeah. And with bedtime in particular, I've found over the years that again, because they're like, first of all, this child has additional needs, and it's so tempting to just say like, well, why don't we do a 30-minute bedtime routine and get them into bed by 7:30? But again, like, you have this child with the additional needs, sometimes actually bumping it out to 8 o'clock to allow space for meeting those needs in the long run is going to be better. um, and obviously, again, with special needs families, there's so many additional things going on, like, you know, and again, I have kids where they go to bed at like 9:30, and I know as a coach, I'm like, this would really be earlier, but to make it like an hour earlier, hour and a half earlier, parents are like, this is a complete overhaul of our entire day
Yeah,
schedule.
yeah, yeah. Too
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like we have to like for that, like we got to break it down into smaller chunks and more manageable chunks so that parents know like, okay, yeah, we can make this 15 minutes earlier and the world didn't end. The house
Yeah.
is not a mess. Like
Right.
we can get this happening. And like the same approach that I take with my kids of like little steps and going gradually, I do it with my parents as well. So they can see, all right, yeah,
We can
we
do
can be
this.
successful with this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to circle back to one thing that you mentioned. You said that, a lot of times pediatricians, especially when it comes to special needs kids, just kind of work under this assumption that like kids aren't going to be able to understand or be able to even achieve this, sleep independence or ability to fall asleep on their own. And
Yeah.
with so many other issues going on, it may not even be the top of their focus. But
Right.
um, I mean, I'm assuming that you found that that's 100% not true,
Of
that
course.
kids do have the ability to learn these skills, and they do have, they can learn to sleep independently. So I just wanted you to kind of comment on that, because I know, I don't know about special needs doctors specifically, who specialize, in these, whether it's specialized in kids who are on the autism spectrum or sensory processing disorders, whatever. But I know general pediatricians really get almost no training when it comes to sleep and like behavioral issues that are involved in sleep, which are the same things that you're dealing with special needs kids.
Yeah, I mean, most medical students, I have a few friends who are med school right now, and they'll tell me like, yeah, we spent 4 hours on nutrition. I'm like, that's it. Right? That's it. Like in 4 years, 4 hours, that's all we get for something like so important, right?
Right. That's probably more than they spend on sleep. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, yeah, definitely more than what is spent on sleep. But I think that, the unfortunate thing is that there are more and more children with neurodevelopmental issues now. So I think these like more developmental pediatricians are kind of coming out of the woodworks. But I think for a lot of families that I work with, they're just going to a pediatrician. So that pediatrician may not necessarily have special training to work with or to know what to look for kids with special needs. And I think that the way I kind of describe it is like, I think a lot of specialists, when they see a diagnosis, it's just like, kid is in a box. So, autism. So that probably means they don't speak, they don't do this, they don't sleep, whatever. Like, what can I even do? Right. But, and I think for parents as well, when you've been told enough times by your therapist, by your doctors, your specialists around you, like your child will never, can't do the, whatever, fill in the blank.
Feels hopeless.
Yeah. It feels really, really hopeless. But I think a lot of families that I work with, they know intuitively their kid is able to learn things. We just have to find that path for that particular child. And even if like the recommendations I make to parents, even if they are skeptical, like, is my child really going to understand this? So often kids understand a heck of a lot more than they lead on, because they're just not able to verbalize or to show that they understand that thing. But as soon as we start to put some of those tools into place, parents realize very quickly, like, oh yeah, no, they understand exactly what is going on. And it's really sad and unfortunate that more doctors and specialists don't know to recommend this to parents. I mean, I've had some kids where they go to like the best sleep clinics, and I had one family, they went to Boston Children's, which is like one of the #1 sleep places in the country. They tried 5 different medications with this kid. And when I asked mom, how does she go to sleep? Mom said, oh, I have to sit on a yoga ball. I have to hold her in a particular way. And we got to do that for 3 hours to get her to fall asleep. And I'm like, well, no wonder she's not sleeping well. She's so dependent on you. Like you could throw 100 medications at that situation and it's not going to change. Right. So
and the sleep doctors never asked that question, or they never thought to try to tackle the behavioral.
Yeah, they never considered it. And this kid, in addition to having like an autism diagnosis, she also had like a rare genetic condition, which is like even worse. Cause like, then the doctors are like, oh, well, it's genetics. We can't do anything about that. Right. So, but I hear that over and over and over and over again of like, we tried this medication, we did this, we did that. And nothing was ever mentioned or discussed with that family of like, why don't we try some kind of sleep hygiene, sleep habit changes, sleep training, whatever, to try and get the end result here, right?
Well, it's so interesting. I think it's like, so many parents start with that medical route, right? With going to the pediatrician or going to the sleep doctors or whatever. And it's like, you ask a plumber and he's going to see a plumbing problem. It's like they're not even sometimes looking for the right thing. And so they never even realize that the solution is more about how parents can modify what they're doing to actually make the changes.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't like, I'm not throwing all pediatricians or whatever under the bus. Like there are some great pediatricians out there, right? But it's as professionals, we have that opportunity to really like uplift and empower these parents when even in 2023 and even during like in this neurodivergence advocacy and things like that, there's still so much negativity around the journey of special needs parenting. And yes, I mean, it's so challenging, and there's things that so many additional things that these parents have to do. But to have that opportunity as a sleep coach, as a therapist myself, to say like there are other ways to solve this, and it doesn't have to be the medication or the melatonin. Like it's not a hopeless situation. And I think more doctors need to know about this for the general population, but especially for special needs kids, like to have that opportunity to, like I said, really empower parents, like you can do this, and there are solutions, is really important.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. I think that these tips in our discussion today is going to be really helpful for special needs parents, and I mean all parents really. A lot of these things really apply to everybody, but certainly in special needs cases. So this is great. So tell people where they can find you to learn more about working with you and just what you do.
Yeah, sure. So you can go to my website. It's melissadomansleepconsulting.com. I'm also on Instagram. My handle is Special Needs Sleep Coach. And then, yeah, you can find me on Facebook, but website and Instagram are probably the two best places to to find me.
Okay, and we'll link to those as well, so people can just click right over and find you.
Awesome.
Well, thanks so much for chatting today, Melissa. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.